With a harrowing inflation rate of 6% over the last 12 months in America, calls have been made to deal with the problem of rising prices. One such solution that you may have heard of is the subtly titled Inflation Reduction Act, which has been proposed and passed by President Joe Biden. The act itself is a successor to Biden's previous proposal called Build Back Better, which failed to be enacted. And the main aim of the Inflation Reduction Act is to, surprise surprise, reduce inflation. But does it actually achieve this aim? And with the scale of such a policy, it of course has other concerns, such as reducing the deficit. In fact, deficit reduction is needed to deal with inflation and is one of the main aims of this bill. This video will focus a lot on measures cutting the deficit and whether they are effective, and even focus on other economic indicators like GDP growth and employment projections. The Act proposes tax rebates and credits for a variety of green measures, a 15% minimum corporate tax for companies above $1 billion in income, a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks, raising the super tax on crude oil and imported petroleum to 16.4%, extending deduction limits on pass-through tax losses, allows Medicare to negotiate drug prices, limits the increase in prices of some Medicare-covered drugs, raising the research and development tax credit to $250,000 for small businesses, provides $80 million to the IRS for hiring and improving their services, and extending the temporary expansion of Affordable Care Act subsidies through 2025 to households 400% above the poverty line. By the way, these temporary expansions don't seem to be so temporary, but we'll get to that. Anyway, let's see if Biden's bill can reduce the deficit. According to the Penn-Wharton budget model, the spending and revenue provisions would reduce deficits by a cumulative $248 billion from 2022 to 2031, while the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the deficit would be reduced by $305 billion. Of course, the projected net benefits may take time to occur, with the CBO estimating an initial $20 billion in deficit reduction, but no significant reductions till 2026, while Penn-Wharton even projects deficit increases until 2026. While the difference in deficits between the two estimates is $57 billion over a decade, it represents less than 0.1% of projected revenues, so the Penn-Wharton and CBO estimates are quite close. But the disparity in the estimates mainly arises from the CBO assuming that the minimum corporate tax raises $53 billion more over 10 years. Penn-Wharton has some further analysis on the inflation bill. Government spending increases due to climate change-related spending and the extension of ACA subsidies being greater than the savings from the prescription drug pricing reforms. Nevertheless, additional tax revenues exceed spending increases, leading to an overall fall in government debt, specifically going down by 4.1% in 2040 and 8% in 2050. This crowds in investment in private productive capital. When taxes on business increases, business incomes fall, which means less money for private investment, which offsets the benefits of government spending. Hence, private productive capital would decline by 0.2% in 2031, cutting GDP by 0.1%. However, over time, government debt falls, where private capital is unaltered in 2040, and even increases by 0.3% in 2050, leading to higher labor productivity, accompanied by a 0.1% rise in wages in the same year. And when combined with the climate proposals, GDP grows by 0.1% in 2050. The act will be financed by the minimum corporate income tax and the stock buyback tax. When looking at who bears the burden of this financing, the Penn-Wharton budget model assumes 75% of corporate income taxes will be borne by owners of capital, with the remaining 25% being borne by labor. But for the tax on stock buybacks, it is assumed that 100% of the burden will be placed on shareholders, as it is based on a discretionary balance sheet transaction rather than income from economic production. Surprisingly, all income groups will be hurt by the business tax changes, with the average burden being $5 for the lower quintile, $55 for the middle quintile, and $61,520 for the top 0.1% of tax units. The loss for lower income groups is based on lower wages over time, while in contrast, the loss for higher income groups is based on changes in the value of financial assets. The table currently displayed shows financial values that indicate how much money a household at a certain age and income distribution would benefit or lose. For instance, the minus $700 value for households aged 40 and within the bottom quintile shows that on average, this household would be $700 worse off for the remainder of their lifetime under this legislation. In contrast, another household aged 20 in the bottom quintile would be $1,900 better off. When looking at the table, you may notice the pattern of current workers and retirees being hurt by these rather than future generations, because the people living now have to deal with lower business investment and lower wages arising from tax increases, while the gains of this policy will take time to accrue, and more likely will be felt by the future generations via lower debt and higher productivity. This trend is further emphasized by how current higher income households will lose out, but future higher income households will benefit, especially with the crowding in of more private capital from lower future government debt. The more conservative Tax Foundation, of course, has their own economic projections for the bill. They use the general equilibrium model to estimate that the IRS enforcement and drug pricing provisions will increase federal revenues by $676 billion, but when taking into account the $352 billion in expanded tax credits, the net revenue will instead change to about $324 billion from 2022 to 2031. The former two proposals are significant, as taking them away will lead to a revenue loss of $84 billion. Other contributions to the massive $676 billion in revenue are $213 billion in corporate tax increases and $54 billion from individual tax rises. In particular, the minimum corporate tax is estimated to raise $153 billion over the decade, when not accounting for behavioral responses like tax avoidance. And the 1% stock buyback tax on domestically publicly traded corporations may raise $48 billion in the same decade. Of course, revenue may be lower if companies decide to reduce their reported financial income. When looking at taxation, the Tax Foundation of course see this aspect as punishing work and investment, hence they believe the Inflation Reduction Act would reduce long-run GDP by roughly 0.2%. Moreover, long-run American incomes would fall by less than 0.05%, but the budget deficit reductions increase long-run gross national product by 0.1%. Yet, even this benefit is offset by tax rises. Capital stock would decline by 0.3%, and wages by about 0.1%, with an estimate of 29,000 jobs being lost. They are, of course, most worried about the 15% minimum corporate tax, which they estimate would cut GDP by 0.1% and cost 20,000 jobs. The stock buyback excise tax, in a similar vein, is estimated to gut a further 7,000 jobs. Regardless, even this right-leaning organization approximates a $224 billion cut in the deficit during the first decade, leading to lower payments to foreign owners of the national debt and a 0.1% increase in long-run GNP. Hence, there appears to be broad consensus amongst the think tanks that there will be large deficit reductions in terms of raw numbers. In 2023, the bottom quintile will see their after-tax incomes rise by 2.1%, mostly due to the ACA subsidies, while the top 1% will see their after-tax incomes rise by 0.1% due to the NEG tax credits, which offsets the fall in incomes, resulting from the minimum corporate and stock buyback taxes. But when the subsidies expire in 2026, the increase in income will be smaller. Also, the value of NEG credits will increase after 2032, meaning the after-tax incomes of the 1% will rise by 0.5%. In contrast to such grim figures, according to researchers from Energy Innovation, the bill could save up to 3,900 lives per year due to reduced air pollution, create 1.5 million jobs in 2030, and increase US GDP by 0.84% to 0.88% in 2030, thanks to the climate provisions. Now I know you, the typical YouTube viewer, love all these economic numbers from multiple economic think tanks, but I also know that you finally want to know the answer to the question of this video. Does the Inflation Reduction Act actually reduce inflation? Well, let's ask political commentator Kulinski.
So Bernie Sanders spoke about this recently, or wrote a piece about this recently. This is in Business Insider. Bernie Sanders knocked Schumer and Manchin's big climate and healthcare bill, calling it the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Here we go. Senator Bernie Sanders blasted Democrats' massive climate and healthcare bill on Saturday evening as senators tried to pass a major piece of Biden's economic agenda after more than a year of debate. Quote, I want to take a moment to say a few words about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that we are debating this evening, Sanders said just after joining Democrats in advancing debate on the proposal. I say so-called because according to the CBO and other economic organizations that have studied this bill, it will in fact have a minimal impact on inflation. For much of the week, Sanders has torn into the $740 billion proposal brokered by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin, which would invest millions in green energy, lower some prescription drug prices, by the way, key word there, some prescription drug prices, and impose a 15% minimum tax on large corporations. Sanders' mention of the CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, is a nod to the nonpartisan scorekeepers finding that the proposal is negligible, at least in the immediate future, and that's as it pertains to inflation.
Is Senator Bernie Sanders correct? Well, let's see from the various economic think tanks and their takes. Penn Wharton estimates that the Inflation Reduction Act would have a very modest impact on inflation over the next decade. From their analysis, the act would place very small upward pressure on prices in 2023 and 2024, reduce annual inflation by 0.1% in about 5 years once the deficit reduction provisions are enacted, but then have no impact on inflation after 2028. These estimates aren't statistically different from zero. Similarly, the CBO estimates show that the impact on inflation could be positive or negative, but any change would be too small to detect, with the impact still being statistically indistinguishable from zero. On the other hand, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget believes that the Inflation Reduction Act would have stronger deflationary effects, particularly on the basis of better deficit reduction than estimated by Penn Wharton. Specifically, that inflation reduction will happen faster, with potentially $30 billion in deficit reduction within the first 2 years. Not to mention that they estimate deficits would be reduced by over $300 billion in the first 9 years and by $1.9 trillion over decades. But if the Affordable Care Act subsidies are extended, then the bill would only reduce deficits by $1.1 trillion. Secondly, energy regulatory reforms such as building energy infrastructure like pipelines increase aggregate supply and put downward pressure on inflation. And finally, lowering prescription drug prices and renewable energy costs of production can mean workers are less likely to push for higher wages, or that businesses are less likely to pass these costs down to the consumer, preventing further inflation. However, even these deflationary effects are likely to be modest. For a less optimistic view on inflation, the Tax Foundation posits that limiting productive capacity could actually worsen inflation via the higher tax proposals. And when they tackle the deflationary measures arising from deficit reduction, they are concerned that projected revenues may be lower than expected, or that revenue may take time to catch up with spending. For example, the history of the corporate alternative minimum tax suggests that the minimum corporate tax's revenue may decline. Scenarios like this could be worsened, as budget deficits may increase from 2023 to 2026, which could exacerbate inflation. Overall, the consensus is clear. Whether inflation is increased or decreased due to the ironically titled Inflation Reduction Act, the effect will be statistically insignificant and undetectable because the deficit reduction, despite being large in raw numbers, would make only a small part of the federal debts and revenues. So it is unlikely that the bill will reduce inflation. It will probably have a neutral effect. So why did Biden and his allies name this bill the Inflation Reduction Act? Well, our progressive friend Kyle once again has an answer.
Democrats have argued the measure will tackle voters' main economic concern, naming it the Inflation Reduction Act. Republicans argue the new spending will aggravate inflation. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says, though, the bill has a negligible effect on inflation, at least in 2022 and 2023. I think in the long term, maybe it reduces inflation a little bit. But again, you guys know this. Inflation is largely about the supply chain crisis more than anything else. That's the biggest part of it. And so will this really address the heart of it? I don't know. I think the reason they named the bill that is because if they're going to get Manchin support, he has to have this cover of like, I'm not with the Democrats and I'm not a partisan, so I'm just interested in tackling inflation, and so we named this bill the Inflation is Bad Act. Like, that's the gist of it. It's all politicking, which shouldn't surprise you guys from politicians.
Seems like a plausible explanation. The current levels of inflation stem from the supply chain crisis, so measures that increase supply are needed. But there only seems to be a few of these provisions capable of doing this, like the energy tax credits. But as I mentioned before, the Inflation Reduction Act may not have a significant effect on inflation due to stuff like this.
There's also a 3-year extension on healthcare subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, originally passed in a pandemic relief bill last year, estimated by the government to have kept premiums at $10 per month or lower for the vast majority of people covered through the federal health insurance program. I think it's keep them at increasing $10 a year or less. I think that's what that's supposed to mean there. But that's an important provision. It probably is one of the more underreported aspects of this bill, is that, the extension of the subsidies under Obamacare is super important because it will help limit the increase of how much health insurance costs, and that is a very important issue.
Regardless of what you think of the Affordable Care Act, as I have mentioned before, government spending increases due to, in part, the extension of ACA subsidies being greater than the savings from the prescription drug pricing reforms. And if the ACA subsidies are extended, then the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the deficit $0.8 trillion less over 2 decades versus if it weren't extended. So maybe we should hope those extensions are temporary. This provision is a transfer payment, which whether you think is necessary, will not increase supply but increase demand, exacerbating inflation. Other provisions like the taxes may have a similar effect, meaning this Inflation Reduction Act may not have been genuinely named, as pondered by Kulinski, but this bill has piqued my interest. There are many provisions in this bill that are worth exploring, such as the stock buyback tax, how its climate provisions are received in Europe, and maybe even exploring the minimum corporate tax. But that last one would take a ton of work, so I'm not sure if I can promise that. It would basically be a series of videos, and I hope you all stay tuned for it. Plus, the stock buyback tax video would itself spin off into another series analysing whether stock buybacks are good for society in general. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give a like and comment, as it really helps my video in the YouTube algorithm. And if you like economics and political commentary, consider subscribing. Maybe follow me on my Twitter, and see you later.